On today's World Insight, most nations in the grips of record heat waves, floods, wildfires, all unprecedented extreme weather. How could global communities adapt to rapidly changing climates? Could these be the new normal?
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and welcome to World Insight. The first day of 2023 rolled out around the world in unusually warm weather, and the year so far proved to be getting hotter. Temperatures have nowhere to go but up across large parts of the world, from Europe to North America, Africa, and the Asia Pacific. That's after the El Nino weather pattern emerged in the tropical Pacific for the very first time in 7 years, the World Meteorological Organization has warned. High temperatures, raging wildfires, powerful hurricanes, torrential floods, are these going to be the new normal? How can we adapt? Is that about the issue adaptation? Before we loop in our panelists, take a look at this.
A prolonged heat dome in the U.S., wildfires off the charts in Canada, marine heat waves covering Europe, heavy rains and flooding in India. The red alert for high temperatures, the highest in a solar system, raised in many Chinese cities. All these never before seen extreme weather. On Monday, the World Meteorological Organization announced the hottest week on record. It follows the hottest June on record, with unprecedented sea surface temperatures and record low Antarctic sea ice extent, as the average temperature of June this year is 0.5 degrees Celsius higher than that of June from 1991 to 2020. While global temperatures are getting hotter and the area of Antarctic sea ice shrank to a record low also in June, 17% less than average.
The first week of July, starting from 4th to 7th, could be considered as the warmest period or the warmest week ever recorded.
The WMO also forecast there is a 90% probability that the El Nino weather pattern would be around the second half of this year. It is expected to be at least of moderate strength. That's after El Nino emerged in the tropical Pacific for the first time in 7 years.
During an El Nino year, you get higher temperatures in the atmosphere as well, because heat is moving from the oceans to the atmosphere. But as you correctly pointed out, we're actually only just at the beginning of that process. So El Nino hasn't had as much of an effect as it's going to later in the year. So we're seeing these high temperatures in the North Atlantic, etc., despite the fact that El Nino hasn't really got going yet. We can expect much higher temperatures from the El Nino in the latter half of the year in sort of October, November time.
The record-breaking temperatures on land and in the ocean have potentially devastating impact on ecosystems and the environment. They highlight the far-reaching changes taking place in Earth's weather systems as a result of human-induced global warming. Many experts say the world needs to approach extreme weather events with joint action. Until then, we can all expect little relief from rising heat.
For the latest discussion on climate change and extreme weather in Beijing, Bingbing Wang, Executive Secretary General of the Global Alliance of Universities on Climate. In Durham, Jackson Irwin, Director of Energy and Climate Policy with Duke University. In Newark, Salim Ali, Professor of Energy and Environment at the University of Delaware. In Beijing, Ma Jun, Director of the Institute of Public and Environmental Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, I want to connect the dots. The extreme weather has really been the phenomenon we witnessed since the very beginning of this year. But Ms. Wang and several other of our panelists, how can we connect the dots? Extreme weather, El Nino, and climate change. What is the link between them? Do they really link with one another? Ms. Wang.
So when we talk about global warming, it's not only about the daily temperature. Actually, according to IPCC and UNFCCC's document, global warming, climate change, as we call it, is annual temperature, especially the average temperature, and the time period is no less than 30 years. So which means that we are calling the global warming now the annual average temperature now is like this, is rising. So it is stable, then the extreme events is like you can predict, and there were not so many extreme weathers. But now, since the temperature, the annual temperature is rising, and there are more and more extreme weathers.
I see.
And you can see, yeah, and the more important why we call it as a climate crisis is because we cannot predict it. It's unexpected.
I see. What about your thoughts, Professor Irwin?
I agree with Ms. Wang, and I will only add there that we build our societies and our infrastructure and our agricultural systems and everything that we depend on with certain assumptions in mind. And those assumptions have to do with what sort of temperatures we will be dealing with, what kind of rainfall patterns, what sort of volumes of water we'll have in our lakes and rivers. When we see these extreme events that accompany a steadily rising climate, we are exhausting those infrastructure and social systems meant to address them. That, coupled with the fact that our global populations are growing and that more and more people are residing and having economic and social activities in vulnerable coastal and riverside locations, and we see an expansion of the impact of heat waves and attendant climate emergency events.
Mr. Ma, if I look at some of the latest numbers, in Beijing, for example, over the month of June, the last month, 13 and a half days, 35 degrees and above. That is the highest number of temperature for the month since the weather report were being recorded back in the 1960s. That's almost unprecedented. So how can we once again really scientifically connect the dots? Or we cannot at this moment yet. It's only an observation among the relations between high temperature extreme weather, El Nino phenomenon, and also climate change. Do we know or do we not know yet?
I believe that most of the scientists have concluded that all these extreme weather events, much of that is a result of the long-term climate change. The global warming is going on. The last 3 years, we have experienced quite unusually 3 consecutive years of the La Nina phenomena. The La Nina phenomena cooled the ocean temperature in the middle and eastern part of the tropical Pacific Ocean, and have some cooling effect on the global temperature. But this year we started seeing the change, the transition to quick transition toward El Nino, which is right to the opposite. It will have it usually gonna exacerbate the warming of the climate. So as a result, we this year, much of some of the extreme weathers, which come earlier and more extreme, as you pointed out. In Beijing and Tianjin, 3 days of temperature above 40 Celsius never experienced. And it's not just Beijing. In July, in part of the Henan province, for example, it pushed toward 44 Celsius. And last year, we actually have experienced some 45 Celsius degree temperature in part of Chongqing. So as pointed out by the blue paper on climate change just issued in China, we have witnessed the rising temperature above the pre-industrial era by 1.13 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
So this built a much higher foundation and will lead to more extreme weather event. And now the long-term climate change plus the the upcoming El Nino effect, and then the ongoing hot air mass, all this work together to cause this. My question is that whether this gonna become the smog moment for us. Just like in the 2011, when Beijing and the big surrounding regions suffered from smog, pollution, and people's rising demand for clean air lead to a extensive clean air action plan launched by the Chinese government. And
Right.
through 10 years of efforts, we made huge progress in cleaning up the air. So the public awareness is extremely important
I
to
see.
support stronger policy.
Right. Of course, you are very passionate about that because you're trying to put out the Blue Air report almost every day on your app. I'll come back to you about the solutions. But to you, Professor Ali, how should we understand the also extreme weather taking place elsewhere in the world? For example, in North America, where you are at this moment, torrential rains and the extreme weather also are taking place. Everywhere almost in the world. Are we on the same page in terms of what to do?
Yes, so with reference to weather systems, they're what we call complex systems. And one of the features of a complex system is that in the short term, it's very difficult to predict what might happen. But in the long term, you can have probabilities which can give you a sense of what changes are there. So that is why it's very difficult to predict the weather more than 10 days in advance, but we can make predictions of long-term climate change. So the probabilities are very clear that we are going to have extreme events based on the research that is now accepted by the international scientific community. However, I would add to that we do have the ability to adapt as a civilization. And most of the world's cities currently, the large financial centers, exist in areas with extreme cold climates, which we did adapt to as well. If you think about New York or Beijing or London or Tokyo, these are cities where during winter, you would not be able to survive without some adaptive mechanisms. You would need heating. So just as we have done that, we can certainly adapt also to extreme heat, but it will require investment and it will require a certain degree of pain. So I don't want to go down the track of the headlines where they're saying, oh, this city will be uninhabitable. I think that is really sensationalism, which is not helpful.
So may I just proceed from where you just answered and ask the question, are we already at the end of the possibility of prevention? How much are we really doing in terms of adaptation? Do we have real tools in terms of adaptation? After all, we can't change the weather almost 1 year, but people have to live in the next few years and they have to have the agricultural output. So what is the emphasis on prevention vis-a-vis adaptation at this point, Ms. Wang, from China's perspective, for example?
Yeah, actually, I think 10 years ago, when we talk about adaptation, it's only happened, in the rural area. But now, more and more urban cities, they have the same challenge. So how to adapt to climate change, because there are a lot of heat waves and droughts. Yeah, so how is a good question. So it's also related to the when we talk about climate change, it's not only climate change, it's about SDGs. So SDG, from UN's perspective, there are 17 SDG, and the climate change is the SDG 17, and there are others. And so now we need to find synergetic solutions to combine climate change and other SDGs, and thus we can reach the 17 SDG together.
Can you give an example?
Climate change,
yeah.
For example, like in a village, when we talk about adaptation, it's not only adaptation, adapt to help the people to build up some dam to reduce the floods, or help them to change their farm speed, to adapt to the heat wave, but we need also to think how to help them to rebuild their village with some new technology, like some new materials, and also to tell them how to protect themselves, and also cooperate with them, like some companies and civil society to provide the enough knowledge and information. So it's a system.
Mr. Ma, China has been building sponge cities, quote unquote. Well, these sponge cities are, trying to make sure infrastructure is being built in a way that is sustainable and at the same time adaptable to natural disasters or extreme weather. How have been the result of these practices so far? Are these experiments successful?
Yeah, China has been making efforts to try to adapt to a changing climate. Sponge City is a response to the changing climate, but also to the water shortage in many regions in China. Traditionally, when we build our cities, we paved up very large regions in the city, which is not permeable to the when there's rainfall, it causes quick floods, and then the floods, the water's gone, and then the city suffers from water shortage. So sponge city means to build our city so that it can help to keep the water, to store the water for and gradually have it to release gradually, and so to both address.
Yes, but my question is: has it been a successful practice given what is happening right now, and how that has been, in a way, increased China's adaptation capabilities, or it's still hard to say at this point?
To much extent, it is successful to deal with the moderate extreme rainfall. But when it comes to the real bad extreme rainfall, like what happened in Zhengzhou a few years ago, when it's coming to something way beyond normalcy, then that was still not enough. So obviously, we need to, as been mentioned, we need to build more, capacity to adapt to that. For example, monitoring and forecasting system, and also early warning. For example, when all this needs to be done, not just on the flooding side, on the rainfall side, but also on the extreme heat side. We also need to build those systems.
Professor Irwin and Professor Ali, how has the United States been doing so far in terms of adaptation, particularly for ordinary people's lives? Meanwhile, what's your observation of other best practices around the world? Professor Ali, maybe you go first.
Yes, sure. So, within the US, one of the things that has been very much on the priority list is changing building design and habitation structures. Cities are changing their building codes in terms of how you insulate the building so that you don't have to have too much artificial cooling. There can be design features in the building in terms of airflow and circulation systems, heat pumps, and many other kinds of technologies which can make for a more energy efficient cooling. One of the concerns has been that we will need so much air conditioning infrastructure. So if we can design better, we can also build underground where you need less artificial cooling. So all of those features are coming now more into the US building codes and facilitating that. And then on the other hand, there is also a much greater emphasis on trying to provide people in cities who don't have resources some places to go for shelter during very extreme hot weather events.
Right.
So those kinds of adaptive features are coming through.
Professor Wu Wing, how do we see, the speed of these adaptation possibilities and the proportion of these in terms of the overall practice? Are they going to be able to handle what we are facing right now, the reality?
For adaptation on a global level, the picture is quite mixed. We'll see real progress, such as what Professor Ali just mentioned, on both some hard infrastructure and some social adaptations and behaviors that can help to address the immediate challenge, particularly in wealthier parts of countries and in wealthier countries themselves. In developing countries, however, there is often a lack of the resources necessary, particularly to build the sorts of physical infrastructure that's needed to keep their citizens safe and thriving. And for that reason, we are seeing growing calls for more resources to be put into different financial pools that can help them build that adaptive infrastructure and those adaptive systems. So funding from places like the Green Climate Fund, from the China-based Asia International Infrastructure Bank, from the Asia Development Bank, et cetera, is increasingly looking for ways in which it can drive both development and adaptation concurrently. There are open questions about how sufficient that funding is and how effective it will ultimately be.
But also about how the earlier promises are being carried out, isn't it? Ms. Wang, G20 summit, I remember there were urgency funding providing to the Southern Hemisphere, especially the least developed economies, in order to deal with the issue of adaptation to the extreme weather and climate change question. That has not necessarily been met. Yet we are also having so many new challenges as we speak. So Ms. Wang, COP is coming up later in the year, as always. Meanwhile, we're also going to see interactions, BRICS, G20, APEC, the list goes on. How will these international multilateral platforms be able to provide another opportunity for the world to see how those early promises being implemented?
Yes, very good question. According to addressing climate change, finance is always a very important issue. Without money, we can manage nothing. But even in Copenhagen in 2009, the developed country announced to contribute money to help developing country adapt to climate change. But unfortunately, the money even now not enough, and it's also related to the question just now. You asked us whether we have some successful case on adaptation. So unfortunately, at global level, there are not so many successful adaptation cases so far, because in the historic, it's a developed country leading the process, talk about emission, but not adaptation. And now we have to face this challenge. It's not only for developed country, but also for developed country. It's very urgent, and then the money and the finance is also very urgent. But as we can understand, every world leader, there are two chessboards in front of them. One is domestic, one is international. So when they think about where to put the money, they have to domestically to think like the Western countries think of their roles. Like the developing country, they have to think about the development of their own countries. So this should make a good balance, and this is the challenge in front of all the world leaders.
Looking inward and looking outward, that seems to be always the question, isn't it? Professor Irwin, where are we now? I've been talking to you over the past few years, in fact, about all of these questions. Deja vu, we're doing it again.
Yeah, certainly. I think it can feel like the same conversation ongoing over and over again. I will say that we're not capitalizing these sources of finance to the degree that was promised in the past, but we're getting closer. And those levels are still insufficient to drive the sorts of adaptation and mitigation gains that we need. But if they are able to be deployed more wisely in ways that can galvanize and facilitate more finance from private sector organizations to come in and to help build the infrastructure that's needed for these countries and societies within them, then that will be their ultimate measure of success.
Well, the ultimate measure of success, I like that word that you use, ultimate measure of success. Go to you, Mr. Ma. Also, I've been talking to you throughout the years at the climate change summits, for example, for many years already about this question, funding. Now, once again, we see climate financing being discussed by China and United States when the U.S. Treasury Secretary visiting China. We're also, according to media reports, likely to see the climate envoy, Mr. Kerry, visiting China if the media reports can be later proved to be true. But tell me more about, is it really about China and the U.S. Or is it about two largest economies, one representing the developed one and one representing the developing one, how they are going to collaborate while at the same time deal with the issues that they are facing in terms of their own categories? Mr. Ma.
Yeah, absolutely. I think China and U.S. are the two largest emitters in the world, and so we are jointly, we're responsible. We have our responsibilities, and both recognize that the collaboration between China and the U.S. paved the way for the signing of the Paris Agreement, yes. And now both set their carbon neutrality target and making their own efforts. But in the meantime, of course, there are different views. One is about whether we should still, for example, honor this common but differentiated responsibilities, since when it comes to particularly the compensation part, I think China's position is that this is mostly the result of the impact is a result of the historic emission made by the industrialized countries. And but in the meantime, China also expressed its willingness to contribute, to help the developing world. So I think China has been making a lot of efforts to try to help with the transition in Africa and in other parts of the world. So I would like to see one day, probably we should have a healthy competition between these two largest economies to help, for example, help Africa, help the least developed and most vulnerable countries. I think we both have the, not just the capacity, but also innovative power to help with that transition.
Well, competition can be easier said, but the implementation of promises probably is more challenging. Go to you, Professor Ali. We have only 30 seconds left.
Yes, I think the US and China have a lot of potential for further collaboration also on issues like critical minerals needed for the green transition, because that's been a source of tension, but it could be a source of cooperation. I'm heartened by the fact that there are now chief heat officers being appointed through private philanthropy like the Rockefeller Foundation to help countries all over the world, including China. So I think that kind of public-private partnership and looking at the full supply chain for the green transition is where cooperation is needed.
Thank you so much, Salim, Ali, Ma Jun, Jackson Irwin, and Bingbing Wang. Appreciate it. Thank you. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tianhui. On behalf of the team, thanks for watching.